Button bash, gonna bash some buttons, yeah!
Hello, Gary here. Welcome to Button Bash. Now, if you tuned into the most recent episode of Button Bash, you may have noticed that I teased a special edition of my feature Psych during my history of Grand Theft Auto. Well, the time has come for that special episode, and we have a guest who's agreed to join us and discuss with us some of the relationships between playing video games and human behaviour. And here it is. We are delighted to bring to you an interview with the distinguished professor and director of the Centre for the Study of Violence at Iowa State University, Dr. Craig A. Anderson. Hello, Dr. Anderson.
Hello, Gary.
Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for agreeing to do this with us.
Well, thanks for asking. It's always nice to talk about one's own work.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad to hear about it as well. If I'd just like to start really by asking about the Centre for the Study of Violence and what sort of work is it you do there?
Well, at the moment, the center's kind of inactive because of funding issues. I mean, we try to update things and whatnot at the center, but we do have some grant proposals out on some aggression intervention studies that we're interested in doing. And we're hopeful that within the next 6 months or so, we'll see some activity, see some funds, and then see some activity there as well.
No, I was saying it sounds interesting. It's never nice to be sitting on your laurels, is it?
Yeah. Well, we're keeping busy with other things. Certainly, we continue to do work on the media effects, both positive and negative effects. In fact, that's what most of our research involves these days. Although we're also doing some interesting work on intergroup conflicts and ideas about how one can reduce some of the biases that are normally built into any kind of intergroup conflict. Conflicts between, let's say, in this country, Muslim Americans versus, say, Christian Americans, and how they view each other and so on. So we've got a range of things going on in the violence domain, and of course, there's always more questions needing answers than there's time to do research. So never a dull moment.
Yes, and inevitably the answers always lead to more questions, don't they?
Exactly.
So how long have you been studying the effects of video games on people's behaviour specifically?
Some of our first research was done in the 1980s, before games were very violent. I mean, video games were really quite new at that time. So you remember games like Frogger and things of that nature.
Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and
yeah,
things like that.
So, but it didn't really take off. We didn't really start focusing on video games much until probably early to mid 1990s,
Sure.
which was shortly after video game technology got much better, and so the graphics got better, and then the games started getting more violent and so on, and that kind of intrigued us as to are there any effects here?
Yes, of course. Well, that answers my next question, which was what first attracted you to the field. So it was the sort of leap forward in technology and the sort of increased realism of the games. Right.
And I was actually very much an early adopter of video games. I can remember playing Star Trek on a mainframe computer where everything was text input.
The old sort of text adventure games. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you'd specify a direction to shoot your photon torpedoes, or where to move your starship and all that. So I've played games for many years.
Do you still play games now?
I don't very often. Every once in a while, a little bit, just to sort of see what the current games are that are out there. I have my graduate students play play games to be, they're the ones that are really the experts at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure they relish the opportunity, do they?
Oh yeah, most of them. Although some of it's interesting. There are huge, of course, gender differences at this level. That the males all come in, they know video games and they've played them a lot. But some of the female graduate students, I have to sort of give them an assignment, learn how to play this game, which is kind of strange in some ways. But
it beats most of the homework I get at university, I've got to say.
Well, I can just imagine their parents saying, well, what have you been doing this semester in graduate school? Oh, I had to sit down and learn how to play, violent video games.
I don't know, do you have children yourself?
I do.
You do? And do they play video games?
Well, they're both adults now.
I see, yeah.
They both grew up with video games. I mean, we always had, from the time my son was pretty young, we've always had video games in the household. Although we screened very early on, we started screening out the violent games.
Of course, yeah.
Mainly because of initially because of the research literature on TV and movie violence. Because at that time there wasn't really much research on video games because they were so new. But yeah, my kids grew up playing games, and there are a lot of good, positive games out there. I mean, there always have been. They're sometimes harder to find because they don't get the advertising dollar that the violent ones get.
No, it's mainly those big AAA blockbuster games that get the big marketing budgets, don't they?
Yes, exactly, and that's been true for many years. But it's also been true that a parent who's really dedicated to finding healthy games can do so. Yes. It just takes a little more effort.
Okay, so obviously we've already touched on it, but obviously the main topic people think about when we're discussing research into video games is the effect on sort of aggressive and violent behaviour. So what does the evidence tell us at the moment? Because there's a lot of mixed messages about whether they can affect real-world aggressive behaviour. So what is the evidence saying at the moment?
Well, the evidence is actually overwhelming, but you're absolutely right that there are mixed messages going out to the general public, but that's largely the work of the industry and some of their supporters doing what industries that make a lot of money typically do, and that is overreact and defend try to defend their product, even if that means deceiving. But the vast majority of experts in the field know, in fact have known for some time, that screen media, TV, films, and of course more recently video games, that violent content tends to increase later aggressive behavior. We know that's true in both the immediate situation, that is, say, within a few minutes after playing a video game, and we also know that there are long-term effects. That kids and adolescents who are exposed to a lot of violent media over time tend to become more aggressive. Again, over time, and by aggressive I mean they tend to do behaviors that are intended to harm other people.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So I mean that's the essentially the social psychologist definition of what aggressive behavior means. A lot of times people get confused, or they think of aggression as being the same thing as when your soccer coach or football coach, or depending what country you're in, yells at you to play more aggressively. Well, what they really mean is play more assertively, right? Play with confidence, play with energy, but they don't really mean go out and try to break the other kid's leg or something. At least you hope that that's not what they mean.
But in psychology, the term aggression means to intentionally attempt to harm. Right,
and basically every type of study that every type of scientific study that can be done in this domain has come to the same kind of conclusion. So whether it's brief experimental studies done under carefully controlled conditions, very often in a laboratory setting, that's the effect that you get, or there's a growing body of longitudinal studies now showing the long-term effects. So, kids, if you get a measure of a whole bunch of kids, say at the beginning of a school year, and you measure how aggressive are they at this point in time, and you get measures of what kind of screen media are they using, are they playing a lot of violent video games or not, and you might get other measures of socioeconomic status and other kinds of variables that tend to be related to aggressive behavior. And then you go back at the end of the school year and you measure these things again. What you see is that the kids who played a lot of violent video games, that their aggression levels tend to get somewhat higher over time. This is after you control for how aggressive they were at the beginning of the school year.
I see, yeah.
Those kind of studies rule out a whole bunch of alternative explanations. I guess the other issue in this domain that there's at least a grain of truth in this notion that there's not as much research on what would be considered violent behavior.
Sure.
And by violent, we typically mean some kind of physical aggression that is likely to result in injury that requires some kind of medical attention. Okay? And certainly there are fewer studies of those because they're more expensive to do, and there's certain ethical limitations.
Yes.
we can't take a bunch of 10-year-olds and randomly assign half of them to play a violent game, half of them to play a non-violent game, then give them all a handgun and see who who shoots the most kids on the playground. Even in the U.S., we can't do that.
No. I'll say we'd really struggle here in the UK,
but but there are studies out there, a number of studies now, showing strong links between violent media exposure, including violent video game exposure, and real-world violent behavior. But again, there are a few very vocal individuals who say there is no such evidence, and in fact there's a whole book that came out fairly recently that made that claim, but they conveniently ignore all the studies that actually show it.
It's sort of selective bias, isn't it?
Yes.
So on that note, so do you believe that playing violent video games could cause a person to become violently in of themselves, or would other factors need to be involved?
Well, typically, that's a very good question, and typically the way we think of it, we being researchers in the violence and aggression domain in general, not just media researchers, is that extreme behaviors, extremely aggressive or violent behaviors, almost never occur when there's only one risk factor present. We think of this as really being the result of a convergence of multiple risk factors.
Sure.
There are dozens of known risk factors for violent behavior.
For example?
Well, things like growing up in a violent neighborhood, certain kinds of other things like ADD or ADHD, attention deficit issues are related.
So sort of mental health issues.
Yeah, and there's some nutrition things, there's some genetic things that are, again, risk factors. But typically when you see, for example, in the U.S., when we have a school shooter, and, the reporters all want, okay, what was the cause? And the answer, which doesn't work well in most of the U.S. press, but the correct answer is, well, there's multiple causes. There is no one cause.
Of course.
And in any given case, you can go in and you can see, well, what risk factors were present? Was there an alcohol involved? Was there provocation involved? What kind of background, what kind of family environment? Did they grow up in a household where violence was used or aggression was used a lot? Father beating on mother or parents beating on children or whatever. And so, what I tell parents is, if you've got a normal, healthy child with few or no risk factors for violence, playing, say, 5 hours of violent video games a week is not going to turn them into a school shooter. It just doesn't work that way. But similarly, putting them on some kind of a diet that interferes with brain development by itself is not going to turn them into a school shooter. But you wouldn't do that as a parent intentionally anyway.
of course.
You say, oh, no, we're going to deprive them of the kind of foods they need. You wouldn't expose them to that kind of a diet, or you wouldn't want them to hang around with gang members, right, from a violent gang. You know, as a parent, you'd try to intervene. Well, again, the media violence thing is a risk factor. It's not the single largest or most important risk factor, but it's also not the smallest. But it is one that parents, with some effort, can have a big impact on with no cost or very little cost. You know, you can't change your genetic structure. If you're living in a violent neighborhood, typically it's because you can't afford to live somewhere else, right?
Sure.
But you can monitor what your kids are doing. You can get the video games and whatnot out of the bedroom or out of private space into public space so that you, as a parent, can monitor it better. So that's one of the things that makes it such an interesting risk factor to study, is because it's something that the individual parent can do regardless of what governments do or, you know, society in general is doing. You can do that on your own.
Another subject, obviously, that's been discussed in the gaming press a lot recently is sexism, and obviously the effects of exposure to sort of over-sexualized characters in video games and sort of stereotypical characters.
Right.
Is there any research into that, and is that telling us anything at the moment about the way it affects people?
There is a little bit of research on the effects of sex stereotyping in video games, and again, the results are pretty much what you'd expect if you sort of view video games as teaching tools, which is kind of how we think of them. You know, kids learn. I mean, once you have your own kids, you know, it's just amazing what they pick up. You know, you have to be very careful about what their first words are going to be if you don't want to be terribly embarrassed by, you know.
Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, 'cause that's what, you know, they're learning machines. And what they learn from some of these games is sexist attitudes, kind of distorted beliefs about male-female relationships. For a lot of kids, when they play a game, and the same thing's true for TV and movies. You know, when you see, say, a same-sex character that is beautiful and strong and, you know, very muscular if you're male, or very pretty and whatever if you're female, that has an impact on their own self-body image, right? They sort of feel bad for a while because you're not built like that. Well, in fact, nobody's built like that in most cases, or only a few people who are, you know.
Certainly not built like the characters in your average video game.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So there is some research that there are some harmful effects of that kind of stereotyping. And there's also some recent research on stereotyping in terms of like racial, ethnic groups as well.
Sure.
So, you know, if you have people play a video game in which the enemy is Arab terrorists, you know, Arab Muslim terrorists, that changes, at least for a while, that changes your stereotypes and your beliefs about Arabs and Muslims in general. And it does so in a negative way. You tend to see them as more aggressive and violent and people that you don't want anything to do with. And again, none of that's surprising from this kind of a learning, teaching perspective. It also turns out that it doesn't really matter whether the individual player can tell the difference between fantasy and reality. You know, that's one distinction that keeps popping up, and so much so that you'll hear gamers, fairly young gamers, say, oh, I can tell the difference. I know it's only a game, therefore it can't hurt me. You say, well, that's not a logical conclusion, and the empirical evidence shows the opposite. You know, so we even get college student participants playing kid-type games. If they have a lot of violence in them, it has an impact on their aggressive thinking, their aggressive feelings, as well as their aggressive behavior. Even though obviously the college students know that it's just a game, it still is having an impact on them. They just don't know that it has an impact on them.
Yeah, we've focused a lot on sort of negative effects. I mean, what about, are there any positive effects from gaming? Is there much research into those? Can there be any benefits?
Yes, there's growing amounts of research on positive effects. For many years, of course, there has been research on like educational games. And we know that games, a well-designed game is an excellent teaching tool. There's a whole bunch of reasons for why that is, but basically it has to do with being able to hold a person's attention, being able to adjust the task levels so that as a person gets better, the tasks get a little bit harder. You can do that, you think of that in terms of arithmetic tasks or whether it's a shooting task. It's the same basic principle. Kids like to be challenged, like to overcome initial difficulties. They feel very good about themselves when they succeed and get better, and then new challenges come along. That's kind of the essence of a video game. But more recently, one of the newer trends, one that actually some of my colleagues and I had a lot to do with some of the initial studies, is to look at what we call pro-social games and their effects on pro-social behavior. By pro-social behavior, we basically mean helping other people in one way or another. And we were able to show in a series of studies that playing a nonviolent pro-social game increases helping behavior, and it does so in children, it does so in adolescents, and we've seen the same kind of effects in college students. So those results essentially mirror the violent game results. At one level, they're not surprising, to any of us who do the theory in this. It's in some sense, it's the same theory. But it is nice to be able to, it's nice for the theory to be tested in multiple ways, and then
of course,
when it's confirmed, you say, okay, now we really do have a good handle on what's going on. We understand what's going on, and that allows us to make some, better predictions about what kind of games are going to be useful long term down the road versus what kinds are going to likely to be harmful.
Well, that's good to hear. It's good to know that sort of research is focusing on those things as well. We're almost out of time, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to talk very quickly about sort of motion control gaming, the Nintendo Wii and Microsoft Kinect, and the sort of more active games. Very, very briefly, is there any findings in that at the moment?
There's a number of people have been looking at obesity in some of the action game stuff, and that's kind of mixed at this point, I would say, in terms of the findings.
Yeah.
Because if you're substituting playing a motion video game for going outside and exercise, playing a real game, you're still not getting as much exercise as if you were outside running around.
So basically, it's better than playing a sedentary game, but not as good as going out and do real exercise. Exactly.
Yeah, and so that's why I say it's kind of mixed. I mean, there's good news and bad news in that research, and the good news is, there's a lot of good skills, and you can teach yoga stuff, and on a really nasty day when kids can't go outdoors, they can get exercise indoors doing. Some of these games are quite fun. In fact, that's the last. The most recent game that I still every once in a while do is on the Wii Fit.
Oh, yes, sure.
Yeah, so we do some of those things. There's some speculation that, like in terms of violent games, that the ones that have you actually enacting the behaviors themselves may actually teach skills that you might not want every 12-year-old in the world to know. How to choke someone or break their neck, or how to... or how to, there's even some, at least one study out there showing that, playing some of these games with a simulated gun does in fact teach gun shooting skills.
I see, yeah.
Right?
Not obviously increase that behavior.
Right. And again, that's not surprising because, we know people learn how to fly from flight simulators.
Sure,
So, this is essentially the same kind of thing. So again, parents really need to be thoughtful about, okay, what is it that's being taught here? And is this something that I want my kids to learn at this particular age? Do I want them to know how to shoot an automatic rifle, or do I, would I rather they learn how to play soccer or something?
No, I'm really sorry, but we're out of time. But thanks a lot for going through all that with us. There's some really interesting stuff there, and it's nice to get a viewpoint from somebody who's actually been there and done the research and has no sort of personal reason to say things one way or another.
Right. Well, thank you for having me on the show. Like I say, I like to share the science as it develops. It's what I do.
We like to share it with our audience as well, so thank you very much, and
You're welcome.
all the best. Well, there you have it. Some food for thought. I hope you'll agree. I reckon the main lessons to take away from this is that when parents think of video games, they tend to think of them as being for children. Like games like Pac-Man and Frogger, these are the games that these parents grew up with. And they're very simplistic, very cartoony, not much in the way of story, adventure, or indeed violence. And games just aren't like that anymore. They're designed these days for children and adults, and they contain themes and content that may not be suitable for both. In the same way you wouldn't let your child look at pornographic material, you wouldn't let them drink or smoke. You should take more of an interest in what sort of media they're being exposed to. And it's just about sitting down and going through the game with them, just watching them play and just making sure that what they're playing is appropriate for their age. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed carrying it out, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode when we'll try and look at other ways in which video games and their related technology can be used in society, both to its detriment and for more positive ways. Thank you for watching. See you next time.